Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Now, recent developments have brought Greenland into the geopolitical spotlight, particularly following U.S. Vice President JD Vance's visit to the island. During his trip, Vice President Vance criticized Denmark for underinvesting in Greenland's security and suggests that the United States could better protect the territory. He also highlighted concerns about the increasing influence of Russia and China in the Arctic region. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss the implication of Vice President Vance's visit and broader strategic interest in Greenland is Ján Michalčák, former head of the Unit for Countering Hybrid Threats in the Czech Ministry of Defense. Now, as an expert in Arctic security and hybrid threats, Mr. Michalčák offers valuable insights into how competing powers are positioning themselves in the region. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning from Prague. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with Vance's statement recently that stirred a little bit of controversy. How would you interpret that the statement of Greenland underinvesting, being underinvested by Denmark?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a really complex one. To make it short, it is vital to remind your viewers that Greenland is in a really strategic position in the Arctic, and both Russia and China have been growing to become major competitors to the US's influence in the region. For example, Russia has built up a significant military presence along its entire coast in the Arctic, which means that any future possible interests by the U.S. are growing increasingly endangered, and the same goes for China. And not to forget, it cannot be ruled out that thanks to the tightening relations between Russia and China, also due to the ongoing war with Ukraine that Russia wages still, it is not to be ruled out that both powers could cooperate in the Arctic and therefore endanger the American interests even more. So on the one hand, the concerns of the U.S. that security around the region needs to be strengthened to preserve the U.S.'s power projections, on the one hand, they are understandable. On the other, we can of course talk about the amount of pressure that the U.S. has been exerting on Denmark, which I think is not acceptable. But what is valid is the strategic concern that the Trump administration has around the region. And I think that the main goal is to force Denmark and NATO allies to strengthen the overall security in the region. But unfortunately, Trump has chosen to do it in a quite unacceptable and forceful manner.
All right, this actually brings up a very good point where NATO defense as well as the defense of Greenland do need bolstering. And there's a line of thought in which perhaps these provocations by the U.S. Vice President as well as Trump's rhetoric of taking Greenland over actually did make Denmark made for investment into Greenland. Do you think that there's a strategic play here that actually perhaps these kind of pressuring method is Trump administration's way of making sure that this part is more secure?
Well, exactly as you say, Denmark has decided to bolster the security investments, I think, by $2 billion, which is a significant amount of money. But to your question, I am not entirely sure that the Trump administration is capable or willing to think in such broad terms. I do think that the result is what the Trump administration actually wanted, which is to bolster and strengthen the security in the region by, for example, increasing the investments. So the result is already there. I don't think that was initially the intent because of how the Trump administration has been behaving, for example, in relation to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I cannot rule out even the possibility that in Trump's mind, at some point, and maybe even now, the possibility of somehow taking Greenland by force, be it economic force or even military force, has been there, although I don't think that has been the primary goal. The primary goal, as you rightly point out, is to have the U.S.'s presence ensured, and Trump is willing to go as far as it takes to ensure that happens.
Right. Now we have the rare chance to have someone who knows like the dynamics in this area here. So let me ask you if you can help us understand the geopolitical implications of perhaps increased U.S. presence or influence in Greenland as opposed to having Russia and China operating there.
Right. You at the beginning of your segment, you mentioned that Vice President JD Vance visited the U.S. base, the Pacific Space Base, which is, to make it clear, one of the most advanced missile bases and radar reconnaissance bases in the whole world. So the U.S. already has a massive interest in Greenland to preserve the power projection that is already there. But because of what I mentioned at the beginning, which is the massively increasing power projections by Russia and China combined, the U.S. is growing, I think, understandably worried that although this one particular base in Greenland is really advanced, the capabilities will not suffice because both Russia and China have been expanding much more rapidly than the US and NATO combined, and due to the changing navigation routes as a result of climate change and ice melting, it is very likely, undisputable I would even say, that Russia and China will be getting closer and closer geographically to Greenland as time progresses. In the very near future, the US could actually find both Russia and China on its doorstep in Greenland. So for the power projection of the US to be preserved, they would maybe need much more than one, maybe a number of such bases along the entire coastline of Greenland, which is now not the case. And I think that by what the Trump administration has been doing is to force NATO somehow to build up more presence, build up more bases, build up more radar stations to deter both Russia and China from the region.
Right, so the picture starts falling into place and the U.S. interest in Greenland starts to make a lot of sense. Now, however, like you mentioned also, the way that the U.S. administration have been approaching this thing is less than acceptable to a lot of countries. Of course, Denmark being on the forefront of this have expressed their concern over that approach. Do you think that might as well fragment the relation between the two countries?
Definitely. Denmark, by the way, has been one of the strongest supporters of the U.S. within NATO, has been a founding member of NATO, and has participated in every single military mission in part of NATO in which the U.S. has also participated. Per capita, Denmark has lost more soldiers defending NATO and defending even, of course, the U.S.'s interest than any other country in the alliance. So that alone, now when you think about the amount of pressure that the U.S. has been exerting in such a context on Denmark, which has been such a strong supporter and has lost much more per capita than the U.S. alone, that alone fragments the relationship enormously. And add to that what the U.S. and Trump have been doing in the so-called negotiations with Russia to end the war in Ukraine, which Russia doesn't want to be ended, by the way. And we have a NATO that is growing increasingly fragmented. And as I said at the beginning, we cannot even rule out the U.S. wanting to take Greenland by force. I don't think it's very probable, but I think the option is still on the table. The Trump administration itself said it. So hypothetically, in one scenario, we're talking about a war among NATO allies, which is just something insane. Were you to ask me 2 years ago, I would have told you you're crazy. But now we're realistically talking about such an option. So yes, the relation is becoming increasingly fragmented.
All right, now I'm just trying to put my kind of put myself into the perspective of being in Greenland, kind of like a small Arctic island, and suddenly being in the middle of all these interests, be it China, be it Russia, United States, NATO. How would a country, like a small country like that, navigate all these different competing interests in that little island?
Oh, that's a massive question. I don't even think the Greenlanders themselves know it because, as you said, yes, it's a small nation, but the island itself is the biggest island in the world. So just defending it would be a massive ordeal and basically impossible. By the same token, if the US were to decide to take it by force, which I still think is not probable, but could happen in one of the scenarios, it would be easy because the base is already there. And so that's one aspect to consider. The second aspect to consider is that, according to a recent poll, I think from early March, 85% of people living in Greenland do not want to be part of the US. But at the same time, a majority of the population wants to be independent. Now they're part of Denmark, of course, but within a few years, they have expressed a desire to become entirely independent, which in itself would be problematic as well, because then the Greenlanders would have to defend the island themselves. Now they have, at least Denmark, the EU and NATO taking care of its security, although the US is now a threatening factor, of course. But were they to become independent, that would become an entirely different problem. So it's a really complicated. The population does not want to be part of the US, but at the same time, they're not really happy with Denmark either. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, I can imagine it might eventually have to be forced to align in one big power or another with all the struggle going on. Well, like you mentioned, recently there's a election that took place in Greenland that a lot of the parties that has been very pro-independent were voted in. Now, the Republican Party in the United States is trying to paint that as some sort of picture where the Greenlanders wanted to be part of the United States, and this independence push is just one step towards that. Would you categorize that as a misread?
I think so. Yes, that's definitely a misread, because to understand why Greenlanders want to be independent, we have to go way back into history, which we don't have time for. But to give you one example of why the relations between Greenland and Denmark have been fraught, in the 60s and 70s, so not that long ago, the Danish government, which was really far away and has somewhat limited rule, but they still forced the native Greenlandish population to undergo forced sterilization, especially the native populations that lived in Greenland way before Denmark colonized it. So women and girls were forced to undergo sterilization in order to limit the population of Greenland. So that's just one of many examples why the Greenlandian people are not really happy with Danish overrule and would like to see their home rule. Of course, terrible things like sterilizations are not happening anymore, but it's still quite a fresh memory of the native population. So the desire is to be understood, but definitely not to be read as a desire to be part of the US.
All right. Thank you so much for your input and insight and helping us break all of that down. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.